Hello, my name is Amanda Smith. I'm a professional storyteller based in Nottingham in the UK, and this is how to tell a personal story for a presentation. This is the part 2 video. In part 1, we looked at how to identify and craft a personal story for a presentation. We talked about the key aim or message that you might have for the presentation, and also an action or a response that you want the audience to make at the end of your presentation. I talked about a storytelling process that I've put together that describes how storytelling is an incredible and powerful tool and how it can engage and also get your audience to listen. So that was the part 1 video. This is part 2. In part 2, we're going to look at how to work your story into the presentation. We're going to match up the story with the key message and the response that you want your audience to make. If you like, the story sets the scene for the rest of the presentation. It gives a little bit more information and an opportunity for your listener to empathise and understand you, your values, the way you work and your ideas. Then I'm going to give you a few storytelling tips. That's just to help you deliver your story with clarity and precision. Before I start this second part of the learning, just to say that this is all based on what I was describing in part 1, so please do go and have a look. And also I'm going to continue using the case study of Federico the potter. Okay, so how to work your story into your presentation. Well, there's basically 5 key points. I'm aware that they might seem like I'm going into a lot of detail, like it might seem a little bit laboured. The point is to really make these points clear, because this is storytelling for a purpose. Your audience knows you're telling a story in the presentation, then it's going to have some kind of a reveal at the end. There's going to be some meaning or explanation there, so they're waiting for it. So you have to deliver. Too much waffling or stumbling or searching around for what it is that you want to say, and your listener will wonder if you're really sure about what you're doing and where this is all going. And what you don't want at this point is for them to be evaluating you, because the whole point of this is to move from critical thinking into that more creative thinking that I talked about in part 1. So, first point is that we transition in. Okay, so that's the way we're moving from the presentation mode to the storytelling mode. Secondly, there's a bit of scene setting, a backstory, where you're going to make 1 or 2 sentences just to give the story that you're going to tell a little bit of context. But like I said, the point is to get into the story. So step 3 is the story, telling the story itself. Step 4 is where we're going to spend a little bit of time, because there's quite a lot of information for step 4, because this is where we make the reveal, if you like, the explanation statement, why I'm telling you this story in a presentation. I'm going to suggest there's 5 categories by which you can reveal a little bit about yourself or give further information through the story that really helps your listener understand you and moves you and drives you towards getting the audience to respond in the way that you want, and also to deliver that key message. And those categories are, you can say something about yourself, which is a little bit of a revelation and invites empathy and understanding. You can say something about your work methods or the work that you do, or even the work that your organisation does. You might describe a time of great learning and how that learning changed you and shaped you and brought you in to be the person that you are today, doing whatever it is that you're doing and making the presentation. You might describe the values you live by or work by. And finally, you might refer to a wider philosophy. This can be something a little bit more societal or universal. For example, the gallery that Federico is pitching to, they might have an exhibition that's about justice, freedom, cultural representation and equality, or climate change. And so he might want to give his audience, his listener, the best possible chance to realise that his collection that he's offering to them is the one that chimes and resonates most with their aims and intentions. And in fact, for the purposes of the whole exercise, I'm going to imagine that Federico's main message, the key message that he wants his audience to hear, is that his exhibition chimes most with their wants and needs. And the key action that he wants them to take is choose me and contract me. Okay, finally, the last step is transition out from storytelling mode back into the presentation, and off you go. Okay, I'd like to go through those 5 steps in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to give you some illustrative examples based on the case study with Federico the Potter. Transition 1. So, you're introducing yourself, for example. My name's Federico and I'm a potter. Now I'm going to tell you a story. I mean, that could be as simple as transition statement in is. Because all you're really doing is indicating there's a change and a story is about to be told. But actually, what you're also saying is they're triggering the idea that the critical listening, the more analytical mode where somebody's scrutinising you, what you're saying, the way you show yourself, the words that you use, somebody will be shifting that into that more helpful creative listening that I mentioned in part 1. And that's really important. You want your audience to be in listener mode and audience mode. Let me give you some examples. You're indicating that this change is happening. There's a move from presentation to storyteller mode. And so Federico might say, "Hello, my name's Federico. I'm a potter. I've been a potter for 15 years. Let me tell you a story about me and my granddad." Or he might say, "Hello, my name's Federico. I'm going to take you on a journey to the Forbidden Land." Now that one's a little bit quirkier. It has an element of humour in there and also a small element of surprise, but because of course we might be making presentations to people that we know really well or the colleagues. There's a lot of information and shared understanding, so you don't need to be very formal. And just to say, I'm sort of choosing this formal mode of describing these points across the 2 videos just because I'm trying to make it as clear as I possibly can. And I thought if I use the most formal and polite way of describing all these points, including the language that I'm using and the ideas that I'm putting forward, then maybe you'll be able to understand them within the space of a 15-minute video. And also the idea is they're facilitating you to completely change and adapt them to however you speak or the language you use and the way in which you use gestures and facial expressions, for example. Because I think it's really important. This is just a facilitative tool and you take it, adapt it and use it in order to empower yourself. Okay, so that's transition 1, as it were. And as I say, it's about getting quickly into the story because you don't want to waffle, you don't want to bring people's minds into going in different directions. You want to just make sure that you're indicating a story is about to happen. Then, step 2, you need to set the context. You need to just say a couple of sentences. In part 1, we described how it has to be quite a severe edit. And to start the story, rather than any other part of the story, that Federico was going to start from the moment he walked into his grandfather's studio, that he'd been denied for all those years of his little life until that point. So, for example, leading up to starting the story officially, as it were, you might say, "I'd never been allowed in my grandfather's studio. They said I was too young. But one day, walking home from school, suddenly we headed in that direction, the doors were flung open, and I stepped inside." And just in a storyteller kind of a way, the opening doors and that kind of aerial view of the character walking in from behind is a really great way of pulling people into the story. So, we've set the scene, and then step 3 is really easy for me to describe because it's just tell the story. Step 4, okay, this is where there's a little bit more to think about. As I said, this is storytelling with a purpose, and this is the point of reveal. People will be waiting for you to say why you're telling a story. You don't want to disappoint them. You want to make sure that that's nice and clear. I'm suggesting there's 5 categories, there's probably more, but there's 5 categories of ways in which you can put that particular emphasis or spin on the story so that you're encouraging people to think in a certain way, in that way of amplifying and setting the scene for the rest of the presentation. Here are the categories. You could say something about yourself, which is a bit of a self-revelation, or lets your audience have a little bit more information about you and the real you and your backstory. Or you could talk about your methods and the way that you work. You could talk about something to do with a point of learning. You could also go on to talk about your values, and finally that wider philosophy. So I'd like to go through them one by one and give you some examples. And then I'd like to show you how they can help you work your way through the presentation to get to that key message and the key response that you'd like your audience to make. So we're going to start at the end of the story, that edit. So Federico finishes his story by saying, "My granddad put his arm around me and he pointed to the pot and he said, 'That is a perfect pot.' And in that moment, I realised, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life." And so that's him showing something about himself, or letting you into a little bit of backstory. And then on to values, on to ways of working. So Federico's granddad put his arm around him and he said, "That is the perfect pot." And I still use my grandfather's traditional making methods in my contemporary practice, which is why I call myself an artisan as well as an artist. And on with the presentation. Okay, the third exploration was around learning. My granddad put his arm around me and he said, "That is the perfect pot." And I learnt something in that moment. Don't rush things. Everything has its own time, its own place, and its own moment. Which is why I've brought this particular collection here for your consideration today. Okay, moving on to values. You want to say something about your own values or the values behind how you make or do work. For example, Granddad put his arm around me and he said, "That is the perfect pot." What I learned from my granddad is this: respect the customer, respect the clay, and respect the quality. And that informs not only my business practice, but my creative practice as an artist as well. Finally, a sense of involving something philosophical. Grandad put his arm around me and he said, "That is the perfect pot." And I've thought about that a lot over the years. What is the perfect pot? Because for me, it's the last pot that I made. But every pot that I make says something about how I feel and see the world around me. And it represents how the forces of that world have shaped and moved me. Which is why I brought this collection for you today, because this collection describes my reaction and my interpretation of climate change in 2020. Okay, so there's 5 examples of how you can begin to move the understanding that an audience member or a listener has about you, your values, your ideas, and your work. And in that way, you're opening up them to understand you a little bit more and to have imagined you and your life and what you bring to your work and the situation that they may wish to be invested in, because they will have their wants and needs as well. And this is the opportunity for you to show in different ways, in a variety of ways, for them to imagine how you fit with their needs as much as while you're making the presentation. And in that way then, you can lead on and refer to that through the presentation. If you wanted to do it in a really relaxed way, Federico might be talking about his collection and he might say, "Oh, well, my granddad, with his traditional method, wouldn't necessarily like this aspect of my collection. But for me, I think it says this, this and this about contemporary society." And so there's a sense of shared understanding. And you can reference that in all across the 5 categories. And so that's a way of starting to piece together in a jigsaw kind of a way, a sense of wider meaning and varied meaning, which your audience now and your listener now has, because you shared that story and you've qualified it with that explanation statement at the end of it, which helps you make meaning and gives wider amplification to not only the rest of your presentation, but also the key message that you want them to hear and the key action that you want them to take in order for you to put yourself in the best position to be considered for the success that you have for your aims and your intentions. And one more thought about those 5 categories. It might be a really interesting exercise to go through them all and to think up a statement for each of them, because what you might find is that you can actually merge 2 together, and so you get the best of 2 kinds of sets of information which you can refer your audience to. Now we're coming to the last part of the video for this learning, for this part 2. And this is about just a bit of 3 tips for delivery. and they are pause, pace and pitch. So you're in your bright presentation mode. You want to bring the story in and you want to deliver it with clarity and precision, and you want your audience to really understand that they're moving into the story and have the experience of going through the story to move back out again. So it's nice and helpful to make it really clear. Pause. If you're in presentation mode and you're introducing yourself, you want to just make a really clear pause when you're about to tell a story. When you're in presentation mode, you might be delivering it in a really bright and higher tone of voice and also at a pace. Hello, my name is Federico and I'm a potter. But then you might wish to then slow it down and drop the tone of your voice and the pace. So for example, hello, my name is Federico and I'm a potter. I've been a potter for 15 years. But before I tell you about my collection, let me tell you a story about me and my granddad, etc., etc. And in that way, as obvious as I made that, that's the idea. The idea is that it's quite a subtle process, and that you'll just do it. In fact, you do it naturally as a storyteller to a degree, and naturally when you're telling somebody a story in a social storytelling situation. But I'm just trying to make it really clear for the purposes of the video. And to transition out, you do the same, but the opposite way around. So you're talking about Granddad, and he put his arm around you, and then you might be saying, and I realised then, in that moment, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. But now I think it's time to talk about my collection. And I particularly like you to notice this particular aspect of my collection, because this is something that I'm really proud of. One last thing to say about storytelling and relationship and engagement with an audience, and it's a really simple fact. If you imagine the thing, the audience will see it. So as you're telling your story, and I'll go back to that idea that the boy was walking in through the open doors and into the studio of his granddad's for that first time after being banned. That if you see that in your mind's eye, if you see it sort of behind the head of the character, maybe slightly higher, almost an aerial view, and you see the forward movement of the boy and the doors open and that kind of sense of a dark, shadowy studio beyond, if you see that movement in yourself, if you're in imaginative mode, your audience will magnetically connect with the fact that you're involved in that creative process yourself, and that invites them in. And it really helps to bring an audience along with you when you're storytelling. Okay, I think I've given quite a lot of information in this video, and I realise that some of these things need a little bit of time to work out, to examine, to see how they work for yourselves. And also, in a way, you need to see it happening in front of you. You need to see somebody use a story in a presentation. Okay, it's been an excellent opportunity making these videos, and I've really enjoyed it. I really hope that everybody out there has got something from this, and that they'll find their own way to take some of these storytelling tips into their own work. Thank you very much. My name is Amanda Smith and I am a storyteller. Thank you. Bye-bye.